You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. What if I told you that the moment many men get married, the rules of the game quietly change, and no one warns you about it? What if the love, affection, and respect you once earned didn't disappear by accident but shifted because the leverage shifted? Most men feel it but can't explain it. The intimacy slows, the admiration fades, the effort becomes one-sided, and you're left wondering how commitment somehow turned into quiet control. This video isn't about hating marriage. It's about exposing the invisible dynamics most men walk into blind. Because marriage isn't a trap by default, but ignorance is. When you don't understand human nature, power, and incentives, even love can become a cage. And the harsh truth is this: society prepares men to provide, sacrifice, and endure, but rarely teaches them how to remain respected once the ring is on. If you've ever felt taken for granted, if you've sensed the shift but couldn't name it, if you've wondered whether marriage rewards compliance more than strength, this video is for you. Watch until the very end. What you'll learn could save you years of confusion, resentment, and silent regret. Number 1. Emotional withdrawal as a control mechanism. There's a quiet moment most people never talk about. It's not an argument. It's not shouting or doors slamming. It's the sudden absence of warmth. Conversation dries up. Affection evaporates. Eye contact disappears. You feel it before you can explain it. This is emotional withdrawal, and when it's used intentionally, it becomes one of the most powerful control mechanisms in a relationship. Not because it's loud, but because it hits the oldest part of the human nervous system, the fear of disconnection. You're wired to seek closeness. That isn't weakness, it's biology. But when affection is given and taken away strategically, it creates an invisible leash. You start monitoring your words, your tone, your opinions. You begin asking yourself, what did I do wrong? And the moment you start asking that question, you've already surrendered ground. The Stoics warned about this long before modern psychology ever named it. Epictetus said, "If you want to be invincible, make no treaty with things outside your control." Emotional approval is one of those things. The moment your inner peace depends on someone else's warmth, you've handed them the steering wheel. Emotional withdrawal works because it trains you to associate peace with compliance. Silence becomes punishment, coldness becomes correction, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, you start bending. Not because you believe you're wrong, but because you want the tension to stop. This is where the trap tightens. You're no longer acting from values, you're reacting from discomfort. Wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." But when emotional access is used as leverage, the outside event hijacks the inside world. Your mood rises and falls based on someone else's behavior. That's not partnership. That's emotional dependency dressed up as intimacy. Here's the part that matters most. Emotional withdrawal only works on someone who hasn't learned to sit calmly with inner discomfort. If silence terrifies you, it controls you. If distance destabilizes you, it manipulates you. The Stoics didn't aim to become cold or detached from love. They aimed to become sovereign over themselves. Seneca warned that the person who depends on another for emotional equilibrium lives in constant anxiety, because what can be withdrawn can also be again. Once you see this clearly, you stop chasing reassurance and start cultivating stability. You don't break this pattern by demanding affection or confronting it emotionally. That only reinforces the dynamic. You break it by becoming internally complete. When withdrawal no longer provokes panic, it loses its power. When silence no longer triggers over-explaining, it collapses. This is where your work begins, not on changing the other person, but on strengthening your inner posture. You stop negotiating your dignity for emotional relief. You stop scrambling to restore harmony at the cost of self-respect. Calm replaces urgency. Presence replaces performance. This doesn't mean you become distant or indifferent. It means you become grounded. You respond instead of react. You allow space without chasing it. You recognize that affection freely given is meaningful, but affection used as a bargaining chip is a signal, not a gift. The Stoics believed clarity was kindness to the self. When you see emotional withdrawal clearly, you stop personalizing it. You stop interpreting it as proof of your inadequacy. You start seeing it as behavior, nothing more, nothing less. Now let's make this practical, because insight without action fades quickly. Start with a daily stillness practice. 5 minutes. No phone, no distractions. Sit and notice the urge to seek validation, approval, or reassurance. Don't judge it, just observe it. This trains you to feel discomfort without obeying it. Next, practice voluntary emotional restraint. When you feel the impulse to over-explain, pause, breathe. Say less. Not as a tactic, but as discipline. This isn't about winning. It's about regaining ownership of your emotional responses. Another exercise: write down what is truly within your control and what is. Your values, your conduct, your self-respect, those belong to you. Someone else's warmth, mood, or approval does not. Revisit this list often. Did this daily in his private writings, not to feel superior, but to stay sane in a world that constantly pulled at him emotionally. You're doing the same work now. Also, strengthen your identity outside the relationship, not through distraction, but through purpose. The Stoics believed a person anchored in meaning is harder to manipulate because they are not desperate for emotional crumbs. Purpose creates gravity. When your life has direction, emotional withdrawal feels less like abandonment and more like background noise. You're no longer standing still waiting for permission to feel whole. The most important shift happens quietly. One day, the silence arrives and nothing inside you collapses. Your breathing stays steady. Your posture remains open. You don't rush to fix, chase, or apologize for things you didn't break. And in that moment, the dynamic changes. Not because you demanded it, but because your dependency. Power, as the Stoics understood, is not domination over others. It's mastery over yourself. Ask yourself this regularly. Am I acting from principle or from fear of emotional loss? That single question will expose more than hours of argument ever could. Each time you choose principle, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Each time you remain calm under emotional pressure, you weaken the mechanism that once controlled you. Marriage is only a trap when you abandon inner sovereignty. Emotional withdrawal only works when you forget who you are. The Stoics didn't promise comfort, they promised freedom. And freedom begins the moment you stop outsourcing your emotional stability. Take this seriously. Practice daily. Build the kind of inner strength that no silence can shake. Because when your center is solid, no one can move you by stepping away. Number 2, weaponized intimacy. Sex as leverage. There's a quiet shift that happens when intimacy stops being a shared expression and starts becoming a bargaining chip. You feel it before you can explain it. Desire turns conditional. Closeness becomes scheduled, delayed, rationed, or quietly withdrawn. Not as a conversation, not as a problem to solve together, but as leverage. And the moment intimacy is weaponized, something deeper than sex breaks. You begin to question your position, your worth, your footing inside the relationship. The Stoics warned relentlessly about giving external things power over your inner state. Epictetus was blunt. If you desire things outside your control, you will inevitably be disappointed. Sex, affection, validation. These were never meant to become currencies that decide your emotional balance. Yet when intimacy is used as a lever, it pulls you out of yourself. You start negotiating instead of leading. You start performing instead of being. You become careful, hesitant, slightly anxious. And the danger isn't the lack of sex itself. It's the slow erosion of your self-command. Weaponized intimacy thrives on silence and confusion. You're not told what's wrong. You're left to infer a just guess. You're rewarded when you comply, punished when you don't. Over time, you may notice your decisions bending not toward what's right, but toward what restores closeness. This is where the trap forms. Not because marriage is inherently deceptive, but because attachment without inner sovereignty creates vulnerability. Wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The moment intimacy controls your emotional weather, that power has quietly shifted away from you. The Stoic response is not bitterness, withdrawal, or retaliation. It is clarity, calm, grounded clarity. You begin by separating what is yours to govern from what is not. You do not control another person's desire. You do not command affection. But you do control your standards, your composure, and your self-respect. When intimacy becomes a tool of influence, the Stoic does not chase it. He steps back into himself. He refuses to trade dignity for access. This doesn't mean you become cold or indifferent. It means you stop negotiating your center. Seneca warned that the person who needs little is hardest to control, not because he withholds love, but because he refuses dependence. Desire offered freely strengthens a bond. Desire demanded or exchanged weakens both sides. When you stop reacting to deprivation with anxiety, the dynamic loses its grip. Leverage only works when you need what's being more than you need your own alignment. There's also a subtle internal shift you must confront honestly. When intimacy becomes leverage, resentment often follows, and resentment, if left unchecked, corrodes your character. Stoicism asks you to notice this early, not to suppress it, but to examine it. Ask yourself, not aloud, but inwardly, where you have surrendered agency, where you have confused harmony with compliance, where you have hoped silence would restore balance. Clarity here is not an attack on marriage. It is a return to self-mastery. You are not meant to beg for connection. You are meant to cultivate a presence that invites it naturally. The Stoics believe that attraction, whether physical, emotional, or relational, flows toward strength of character. When you anchor yourself in discipline, purpose, and self-respect, you stop emitting need. And need is the oxygen that keeps manipulative dynamics alive. Remove it and the fire fades. Here, where action matters. First, practice emotional fasting, not from affection but from reaction. The next time closeness feels conditional, do nothing impulsive. No bargaining, no sulking, no internal collapse. Sit with the discomfort, breathe. Observe your thoughts without obeying them. This trains you to remain sovereign under pressure. Epictetus would call this practicing freedom. Second, rebuild your internal reward system. If your sense of worth rises and falls with intimacy, you've outsourced your stability. Each day, anchor your satisfaction in effort, discipline, and progress, things no one can withhold. Physical training, intellectual focus, stillness. These are not escapes, they are fortifications. When your life feels full, leverage loses potency. Third, speak less but with more precision. Stoicism does not advocate silence as submission. It advocates speech without desperation. When you choose to address intimacy, do so calmly, directly, without accusation or pleading. The tone matters more than the words. You're not asking for permission to be close. You're expressing a standard. And standards, when held without emotional volatility, reshape dynamics. Fourth, detach outcome from identity. Whether intimacy flows or stalls, you remain whole. This is not emotional withdrawal. It is psychological independence. Reminded himself daily that nothing external can damage the soul unless the soul agrees. When you internalize this, intimacy becomes an expression of connection again, not a test of worth. Over time, something changes, not magically, not overnight, but steadily. You stop feeling trapped. You stop scanning for approval. You stop measuring yourself by access. And paradoxically, this grounded detachment often restores balance, because desire cannot thrive where pressure lives, but it often returns where strength resides. Marriage is not a trap. Dependence is. Manipulation is. The Stoics never warned against commitment. They warned against surrendering the self. When intimacy is no longer your emotional lifeline, it loses its power to be weaponized. And what remains, if nurtured with clarity and character, can finally become mutual again. So take this with you: you don't win this game by playing harder. You win by refusing to play at all, by standing so firmly in your own mind that no affection can shake you. That is Stoic power. Quiet, unprovable, unbreakable. Number 3, silent expectations that are never communicated. There is a quiet tension that builds when expectations live only in the mind and never reach the surface. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It grows silently, feeding on assumptions, on unspoken rules, on the belief that you should just know. And over time, that silence becomes heavier than any argument ever could. What you're dealing with here isn't cruelty or malice. It's confusion disguised as certainty. One person carries a mental checklist. The other walks blindly past it, unaware that points are being deducted. The Stoics warned against this kind of inner theater. Wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Silent expectations are exactly that, imagined contracts. You're being measured against standards you never agreed to, judged by rules that were never explained, and corrected for mistakes you didn't know you were making. And the danger isn't just misunderstanding. The danger is resentment quietly hardening into identity. When expectations remain unspoken, they don't stay neutral. They turn moral. They become stories like, "If you loved me, you would know," or "If you cared, you'd do this without being asked." These thoughts feel justified, even noble, but they are neither fair nor productive. Epictetus was blunt about this. If someone does wrong, it is because they are mistaken about what is right. Silence guarantees that mistake continues. You cannot correct what is never revealed. This is where you need clarity, not compliance. Strength here is not guessing better. Strength is refusing to play a game where the rules change in secret. Stoicism never taught mind reading. It taught responsibility. Each person is responsible for their own judgments, desires, and expressions. When expectations are hidden, responsibility is outsourced to intuition, and intuition is unreliable under emotional pressure. You may feel the urge to overadjust, to become hypervigilant, to scan moods, tones, pauses, to anticipate what hasn't been said. That path leads to anxiety, not harmony. Seneca warned, "He who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." Trying to satisfy silent expectations turns you into a permanent apprentice, never certified, always correcting yesterday's invisible error. What's required instead is a shift in posture. You stop reacting to emotional weather and start insisting on language. Calm language, adult language, not accusations, not ultimatums, clarity. You don't demand. You invite articulation. You make it clear without hostility that you respond to what is spoken, not what is imagined. This isn't coldness, it's honesty. There is power in saying, internally and externally, "I can't meet expectations I don't know about, and I won't punish myself for failing a silent test." That thought alone changes your energy. You move from defensive to grounded, from apologetic to composed, from reactive to deliberate. Stoicism is not about winning arguments. It's about refusing unnecessary suffering. Now this requires discipline, because silence often hides behind emotion. When expectations remain unspoken, they often emerge as disappointment, withdrawal, or irritation instead of words. Your task is not to decode those signals endlessly. Your task is to respond with steadiness, with presence, with the quiet confidence that says, "Speak plainly and I will listen. Stay silent and I will not invent meaning." Here's a practical exercise to ground this mindset. Take a moment alone and write down the expectations you believe are being placed on you, but haven't been clearly stated. Don't judge them, just list them. Then write a second list, expectations you've placed on others without fully expressing them. This exercise isn't about blame, it's about symmetry. Stoicism teaches you to apply the same standard inward that you apply outward. Another exercise, practice translating emotion into language. When tension appears, rehearse internally a calm sentence that invites clarity rather than conflict, not defensively, not sarcastically, simply neutrally. The goal is not to force communication but to normalize it. Over time, this retrains the dynamic. Silence stops being rewarded. Expression becomes the path of least resistance. Remember, Stoicism never promises comfort. It promises freedom. Freedom from guessing games. Freedom from emotional debt you never agreed to. Freedom from the slow erosion of self-respect that happens when you keep apologizing for crimes that were never defined. Reminded himself, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. In this context, the injury is not intentional harm, it's confusion. And your response is clarity, not retaliation. You also need to guard against adopting silent expectations yourself. It's easy to criticize what you also practice. Stoic discipline demands consistency. If you expect something, say it cleanly, without drama, without moral weight. Expectations expressed calmly become preferences, not traps. Expectations left unspoken become weapons, usually turned inward first. The deeper truth is this: relationships don't break from too much honesty, they break from too much interpretation. When meaning replaces language, imagination replaces reality, and imagination unchecked is rarely kind. Epictetus said, "It is not things that disturb us but our judgments about things." Silent expectations thrive entirely on judgment. Your job is not to be perfect, it's to be clear. To live in alignment with what you can control, your words, your actions, your standards. You can invite openness, you cannot force it. And when you stop chasing invisible approval, something important happens. You regain solidity, you stop shrinking, you stop performing. Adopt this habit, respond to what is said, not what is implied. Act on what is communicated, not what is assumed. When silence appears, remain calm, grounded, unmoved. That alone changes the balance, because clarity is unsettling to games built on ambiguity. And finally, remind yourself daily of this Stoic truth. You are responsible for your conduct, not for meeting expectations that were never voiced. That mindset doesn't make you harsh. It makes you free. Number 4, shifting goalposts after commitment. At some point, usually after commitment locks in, you start to feel it, that quiet, unsettling shift. What once felt enough suddenly is. The rules you thought you were playing by begin to move inch by inch, just out of reach. The effort that once earned appreciation now earns silence. The standards change, but no announcement is made. And if you don't name this pattern clearly in your own mind, it slowly erodes you. This is what shifting goalposts looks like. And it's one of the most psychologically exhausting dynamics a man can experience inside marriage. Not because expectations exist, expectations are part of life, but because the finish line keeps moving after you've already committed to the race. You need to understand this without anger and without denial. Shifting goalposts is not about a single demand or request. It's about instability. It's about never being able to land, never being allowed to say, "This is enough." What earned affection before now earns neutrality. What once felt like partnership starts to feel like probation. And the danger isn't just external pressure, it's what happens internally. You begin negotiating with yourself. You start wondering if more effort will finally bring peace. You tell yourself that if you adjust a little more, give a little more, bend a little further, the ground will stop moving. It rarely does. The Stoics warned against this exact trap, though they used different language. Epictetus said, "If you seek tranquility, do less, but do what is essential." The problem with shifting goalposts is that essential is never defined. The demands are elastic. They stretch to absorb whatever you give. And when you live inside that dynamic, your mind never rests. You are always reacting, always adjusting, always trying to anticipate the next requirement. That state is the opposite of Stoic strength. It places your peace in someone else's hands. Here's the uncomfortable truth you need to face calmly. Once commitment is secured, incentives change. That doesn't make anyone evil, it makes them human. But if you are not grounded in your own standards, your own limits, your own internal compass, you will become easy to reshape. You will confuse love with appeasement. You will mistake endurance for virtue. Warned himself, if it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it. Apply that inward. If a demand violates your self-respect, if it forces you to betray your values or live in constant self-doubt, it is not right, no matter how softly it's framed. The most damaging part of shifting goalposts is how subtle it is. There's no explosion, no dramatic turning point, just a slow where you're always one step behind. And because you're invested, because you care, because you believe in commitment, you keep chasing the moving standard. Over time, your identity shrinks. Your confidence dulls. You become outcome dependent, measuring your worth by approval that is increasingly conditional. Seneca warned, "He who depends on another for happiness makes his happiness fragile." This is exactly that fragility taking shape. The Stoic response is not rebellion, it's clarity. You don't regain power by arguing about every demand or proving your effort. You regain power by recentering yourself, by deciding, internally first, what you will and will not move on. The Stoics believed that no one can harm you unless you consent internally. That doesn't mean you accept mistreatment. It means you stop outsourcing your sense of adequacy. You stop chasing shifting standards and return to fixed principles. This is where action begins, not loud action, quiet action. The first practice is internal auditing. Sit with yourself away from distraction and write down what you believe a fair partnership requires from you and what it does not. Not what keeps the peace, not what avoids conflict. What is aligned with your values? Ask yourself, if the goalposts moved again tomorrow, what would I still stand by? That list becomes your anchor. Without it, you drift. The second practice is emotional restraint. When expectations shift, the instinct is to explain, justify, overfunction. Resist that urge. The Stoics trained themselves to pause between stimulus and response. Wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." When new demands appear, don't rush to comply or defend. Pause. Let silence do its work, not as punishment but as composure. You cannot think clearly while trying to be approved of. The third practice is consistency without chase. Do what you believe is right because it is right, not because it might restore validation. When your actions are grounded in self-respect rather than negotiation, something powerful happens internally. You stop feeling frantic. You stop monitoring reactions. You return to yourself. This doesn't guarantee the dynamic will change, but it guarantees you won't disappear inside it. You must also release the illusion that effort alone stabilizes relationships. Effort without boundaries teaches others that your limits are flexible. Epictetus was blunt. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. Sometimes that means refusing to perform endlessly. It means being willing to disappoint in order to remain intact, not with hostility, with calm certainty. A crucial exercise here is negative visualization. Imagine clearly and honestly what happens if the goalposts never stop moving, not to scare yourself, but to sober yourself. Can you live 10 years in a state of perpetual adjustment? If the answer tightens your chest, listen. Stoicism is not about optimism. It's about reality faced without flinching. Another daily practice is voluntary discomfort. Choose small moments where you do not seek approval. Say less, explain less, fix less. Let the world respond however it will. This trains your nervous system to detach from constant evaluation. Over time, you realize you are still standing, still whole, still capable. Understand this deeply. The trap is not marriage itself. The trap is losing your inner authority after commitment. When you hand that over, the rules will always change, because there is no fixed reference point anymore. But when you stand rooted in principle, something shifts. Even if nothing external changes, you regain something far more important: yourself. Seneca wrote, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." This is that proving ground, not through endurance of instability, but through mastery of your responses. You don't need to win arguments. You don't need to expose anyone. You need to stop abandoning your own standards in the hope of stability. So take a breath, slow down, step back into your frame, decide who you are regardless of moving goalposts. Build a life where your worth is not measured by ever-changing demands. When your center is solid, no shifting standard can unmake you. And that, more than anything, is freedom. Number 5, rewarding compliance, punishing independence. There's a quiet pattern that often goes unnoticed until it's already reshaped your behavior. It doesn't arrive with shouting or ultimatums. It arrives subtly: approval when you comply, distance when you don't, warmth when you align, coldness when you assert yourself. Over time, this rhythm teaches you something without ever saying it out loud. Stay agreeable, stay rewarded. Stand firm, get punished. And if you don't consciously interrupt this pattern, it trains you out of your independence while convincing you it's all for harmony. The Stoics warned about this long before modern relationships existed. Epictetus was blunt when he said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." What he was pointing to is this: the moment you allow external reactions to govern your inner direction, you stop being free. When approval becomes your currency, your autonomy becomes negotiable. You begin editing your thoughts before you speak them. You begin shrinking your decisions to avoid friction. Not because you believe you're wrong, but because resistance now comes with a cost. Rewarding compliance isn't about love, it's about conditioning. You feel it when agreement earns peace, affection, or ease. You feel it when disagreement earns silence, withdrawal, or emotional distance. Slowly, you internalize the message that independence is unsafe. You stop acting from principle and start acting from prediction. How will this be received? What reaction will this trigger? Is this worth the fallout? That mental calculus is the beginning of self-betrayal. Reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. But when rewards and punishments dictate your behavior, that power leaks away. You're no longer choosing your actions based on reason. You're choosing based on anticipated emotional consequences. And the danger isn't the disagreement, it's the erosion of your internal authority. What makes this especially disorienting is how reasonable it can feel. You tell yourself you're being accommodating, mature, easygoing. You convince yourself that peace is more important than truth. But Stoicism never confused peace with passivity. True harmony comes from alignment with your values, not from suppressing them. Seneca warned that he who lives in fear will never be free. Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like hesitation, like overthinking, like choosing silence when clarity is needed. Punishing independence doesn't always look like anger. Sometimes it's emotional absence. Sometimes it's disapproval disguised as concern. Sometimes it's a subtle shift in tone that makes you second-guess yourself. The mind picks up on these cues quickly. It adapts. It learns which behaviors are safe and which invite discomfort. And if you're not careful, you'll start outsourcing your spine. The Stoic response isn't rebellion or defiance. It's firmness without bitterness, calm without retreat. The goal isn't to provoke, it's to remain anchored. Epictetus taught that no one can harm you unless you consent to it. The punishment only works if you accept it as authority. The reward only controls you if you crave it more than self-respect. Here, where action matters, begin by noticing the moments you hesitate, the pauses before you speak, the decisions you soften to avoid tension. Awareness is the first act of resistance. You don't need to correct everything at once. Just observe. Ask yourself, am I choosing this because it's right or because it's easier? That single question cuts through years of conditioning. Next, practice voluntary discomfort. The Stoics trained themselves to withstand unease so they wouldn't be ruled by it. Choose small acts of independence deliberately. Hold a position calmly without justifying it excessively. Let silence exist without rushing to repair it. Not as punishment, not as protest, but as proof to yourself that you can survive disapproval without collapsing. Another exercise is internal rehearsal. Before important conversations, remind yourself that approval is not a requirement for self-respect. Repeat words quietly. I cannot be harmed by what I do not consent to. This shifts your posture from defensive to grounded. You're no longer seeking permission to exist as yourself. You must also rebuild your reward system. Right now, the external response may be training you. Flip that. Reward yourself internally for clarity, honesty, and restraint. Feel pride when you remain composed instead of reactive. Satisfaction when you choose principle over appeasement. This is how you reclaim authority, by becoming your own judge. Stoicism doesn't teach you to withdraw from relationships. It teaches you not to disappear inside them. Independence isn't selfishness, it's stability. A person who cannot be punished into submission cannot be manipulated by reward either. They engage freely, not fearfully. They give because they choose to, not because they're trained to. Over time, something interesting happens. The pattern loses power, not because the other person changes, but because you do. The emotional levers stop working when they no longer control your decisions. You become steady, predictable in the best way, calm under pressure, and that steadiness becomes your shield. Remember this: marriage, commitment, partnership, none of these are traps by default. The trap is surrendering your inner freedom for external peace. The Stoics lived under emperors, exile, and constant uncertainty, yet they guarded their independence fiercely. If they could do that under tyranny, you can do it under emotional pressure. You are not here to be trained like a response machine. You are here to live deliberately, to act from reason, to remain whole. Start today. Notice the pattern, interrupt it gently, and choose the harder path of self-respect over the easier path of approval. That is where unshakable strength begins. Number 6, using guilt and victimhood to maintain power. There is a quiet form of power that doesn't shout, doesn't threaten, and doesn't demand outright obedience. It whispers, it sighs, it looks wounded, and if you're not careful, it can slowly reshape your behavior without you ever realizing when you stop choosing freely. Using guilt and victimhood to maintain power works precisely because it doesn't look like power at all. It looks like pain, and that is why it's so effective. You're conditioned to respond to suffering. You're wired to protect, to fix, to step in. Over time, guilt becomes a lever, not the loud kind that accuses, but the subtle kind that makes you question yourself. You begin to feel responsible not just for your actions, but for someone else's emotional state. And once that happens, your freedom quietly shrinks. You start editing yourself. You speak less honestly. You comply faster. Not because you agree, but because you don't want to be the cause of distress. The Stoics warned about this long before modern relationships existed. Epictetus was blunt. If you want to be free, Do not wish that events happen as you want them to, but wish them to happen as they do happen. Emotional freedom begins the moment you stop believing you are responsible for managing another adult's inner world. Guilt-based control thrives when you confuse compassion with submission. When empathy becomes obligation, power has already shifted. Victimhood, when used repeatedly, creates a moral imbalance. One side is always suffering, the other is always defending. Over time, this dynamic erodes your authority over your own decisions. You find yourself justifying choices that require no justification. You apologize for boundaries. You explain yourself into exhaustion. And slowly, the narrative forms. You are the problem and compliance is the solution. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't lose power all at once. You give it away in small emotional transactions. A pause before you speak, a swallowed opinion, a decision made to avoid fallout instead of to honor your values. Reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Guilt-based dynamics invert this truth. They train you to believe someone else's emotions control your actions. That is not strength. That is emotional outsourcing. Stoicism doesn't teach you to be cold. It teaches you to be clear. Calm clarity dissolves manipulation because it refuses to be rushed, cornered, or emotionally blackmailed. When guilt appears, you don't argue with it. You examine it. Is this guilt rooted in a real moral failure, or is it manufactured through emotional framing? That distinction changes everything. One of the most powerful habits you can adopt is emotional separation without emotional abandonment. You can acknowledge feelings without surrendering agency. You can say, internally and calmly, I hear the emotion, but I decide the action. Seneca wrote, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Guilt thrives in imagination. It survives on predicted consequences, anticipated resentment, and imagined emotional collapse. When you slow down and ground yourself in what is actually happening, its grip weakens. Power maintained through victimhood depends on urgency. It needs you to react quickly, to fix immediately, to prove goodness through sacrifice. Stoic discipline interrupts this cycle. Pause becomes your shield. Silence becomes your filter. Time exposes patterns that urgency hides. Now, this is where responsibility returns to you. You must stop mistaking self-sacrifice for virtue. Stoicism never glorified martyrdom. It praised reasoned action aligned with values. If your choices are driven by fear of guilt rather than commitment to principle, you're not acting virtuously, you're acting defensively. Here's a practical exercise. For the next few days, notice every moment you feel compelled to explain yourself emotionally. Not clarify, explain. The difference matters. Explanation seeks permission. Clarity states position. Each time you catch yourself over-explaining, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, am I acting from reason or from emotional pressure? Write the answer down. Awareness alone begins to restore balance. Another exercise, practice internal boundary statements. You don't need to say them out loud. Say them to yourself. I am responsible for my actions, not someone else's reactions. Repeat it until it stops feeling rebellious and starts feeling obvious. This is not cruelty. It is psychological adulthood. Understand this deeply. Victimhood loses power when it stops receiving emotional rewards. When guilt no longer produces compliance, it either dissolves or escalates. Your task is not to manage the outcome. Your task is to remain steady. Again, be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over. It stands unmoved and the raging of the sea falls still around it. This steadiness changes you. You stop negotiating your self-respect. You stop confusing peace with appeasement. You realize that love does not require self-erasure and harmony does not demand silence. Real connection can survive honesty. Only fragile power structures collapse under it. If marriage or any long-term bond begins to feel like a trap, it's rarely because of commitment itself. It's because emotional leverage has replaced mutual respect. And the way out is not confrontation or domination. It's composure, consistency, calm refusal to be steered by guilt. You don't need to harden your heart. You need to strengthen your spine. Start today. One boundary, one pause, one decision made without apology. Over time, your presence will change. The dynamic will change, and most importantly, you will change. Because the moment guilt stops controlling you, you become impossible to trap. Number 7, gradual erosion of respect through familiarity. Respect rarely disappears in a dramatic moment. It doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes quietly through comfort, through repetition, through the slow, numbing effect of familiarity. This is where most men misunderstand what's happening. You assume love automatically preserves respect. The Stoics would tell you the opposite. Nothing is preserved without conscious effort. What you stop tending to begins to decay. And when respect fades, everything else in a marriage becomes fragile, unstable, negotiable. At the beginning, you were intentional. Your words had weight. Your presence carried gravity. You chose your actions carefully. Over time, comfort whispered a lie. That effort was no longer required. Familiarity invited shortcuts. Discipline softened. Boundaries blurred. And without noticing it, you began showing up less as a grounded man and more as a predictable one. The Stoics warned against this drift, wrote that most people live as if they'll be alive forever, delaying seriousness, postponing self-command. Respect doesn't vanish because of cruelty. It vanishes because of complacency. When someone believes they fully know you, when nothing about you feels anchored or self-directed anymore, admiration quietly dissolves. Not because you became weak, but because you stopped being deliberate. Familiarity exposes everything you no longer regulate. Your reactions, your tone, your emotional leakage. The Stoics were obsessed with mastery for this reason. Epictetus said that no man is free who cannot govern himself. When self-governance slips, respect follows it out the door. This erosion doesn't require conflict. It thrives in peace. It grows in routine. It feeds on unchecked availability and emotional overexposure. When you stop choosing yourself daily, when your inner life becomes empty of challenge, purpose, and restraint, the dynamic shifts. Respect is not demanded. It is felt. And it is felt when your actions reflect self-command, not dependency. Seneca warned that familiarity breeds contempt not because people are cruel, but because they mistake closeness for permission to stop being disciplined. When you abandon standards internally, others sense it externally. You may still be loved, but love without respect becomes unstable. It becomes conditional, negotiable, transactional. And this is where men feel trapped, confused, wondering how something that felt solid slowly lost its weight. The Stoics would urge you to stop blaming the other side and start auditing yourself. Not with shame, but with clarity. Ask yourself where you traded self-respect for comfort, where you began reacting instead of choosing, where you allowed emotions to run ahead of reason. Respect erodes when you stop being a man of principle and become a man of moods. When your inner world becomes reactive, the outer world stops responding with reverence. You don't restore respect by demanding it. You restore it by becoming grounded again, by returning to inner discipline, by reclaiming silence where you used to, calm where you used to justify, stillness where you used to chase reassurance. Reminded himself that worth comes from doing what is right, not from being recognized for it. That's the mindset that stabilizes respect. You stop performing. You start being. Here, something you can practice quietly without announcing it. Begin each day by deciding what will not control you. Your impulses, your need to be understood, your urge to react immediately. This single shift restores gravity to your presence. When you pause instead of react, when you choose restraint over expression, you communicate strength without words. Respect grows in the absence of desperation. Another exercise: reduce your emotional leakage, not suppression containment. Stoicism never taught emotional numbness. It taught emotional command. Feel everything, express selectively. When your emotions are not constantly on display, they regain value. When your words are fewer, they regain weight. Respect responds to scarcity, not excess. Train yourself to do difficult things without announcing them. Difficulty sharpens character. Comfort dulls it. Seneca wrote that a man who has endured hardship without complaint becomes unshakable. This internal toughness radiates outward. People may not know why they feel it, but they feel it. And respect follows what feels solid. You must also return to self-direction. A man who has no internal compass becomes negotiable. One who lives by principle becomes immovable. Ask yourself daily, did I act according to reason today or according to convenience? The Stoics measured themselves by this standard relentlessly. That's why their words still carry power centuries later. Familiarity doesn't have to destroy respect, but it will expose whatever you've neglected. If you've neglected your discipline, it exposes weakness. If you've maintained your inner order, it exposes strength. Respect is not lost because someone sees more of you. It's lost when what they see lacks structure. This is where the illusion of marriage as a trap comes from. It's not the institution. It's the internal decay that goes unaddressed. When a man stops cultivating himself, he feels confined by the reflection he helped create. Stoicism offers a way out, not by escape, but by elevation. You don't leave the situation. You outgrow the version of yourself that lost command. Start today. One controlled reaction, one moment of silence instead of explanation, one deliberate action chosen because it aligns with your values, not because it avoids discomfort. These are small acts, but they rebuild something massive. Respect doesn't return loudly. It returns quietly. And when it does, the entire dynamic changes, without a single argument, demand, or plea. As the Stoics understood, power begins within. When you reclaim authority over yourself, respect follows naturally. And when respect is restored, the question stops being whether marriage is a trap and becomes whether you are living as a man who can never be diminished by familiarity. Number 8, leveraging social pressure and shame. You need to understand this clearly, calmly, without anger or denial. Social pressure and shame are among the oldest control tools in human relationships. They are subtle, indirect, and powerful precisely because they don't look like force. They look like morality. They look like what people will think. They look like disappointment, raised eyebrows, silence, comparison, and moral framing. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The Stoics warned about this long before modern relationships existed. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." That wasn't a throwaway line. It was a warning about how deeply the fear of judgment enslaves the mind. Shame works because you've been trained to value approval more than truth. Somewhere along the way, you learned that harmony matters more than honesty, that being liked is safer than being firm, that disagreement risks exile. Social pressure exploits this conditioning. It doesn't attack your logic, it bypasses it. It whispers that resistance will cost you reputation, peace, belonging, or moral standing. And if you haven't trained yourself to separate your inner authority from the crowd's approval, you fold without realizing you've done so. Reminded himself daily, I can choose not to be harmed, and I won't feel harmed. That choice disappears the moment shame dictates your decisions. You feel this pressure not because you are weak, but because you are human. Humans are tribal by nature. Shame evolved as a social survival mechanism. But what once kept tribes intact now keeps individuals trapped. When pressure is applied through language like obligation, sacrifice, or what a good person would do, It's designed to move you emotionally while pretending to be ethical. And if you don't pause, if you don't interrogate the feeling, you confuse discomfort with wrongdoing. The Stoics were ruthless about this distinction. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Shame thrives in imagination. It survives on unseen audiences and hypothetical judgments. Here's the shift you need to make. Stop treating social discomfort as evidence of moral failure. It is. It's often evidence that you're stepping outside a role others benefited from you playing. That's why resistance feels heavy. Not because you're wrong, but because expectations are being disrupted. When you internalize this, pressure loses its grip. You no longer rush to explain yourself. You stop defending every boundary. You let silence do the work. This is not coldness. This is self-respect practiced quietly. To build this muscle, you must train your perception. The Stoics believe that events themselves are neutral, only judgments create suffering. So when shame arises, your task is not to react, but to observe. Ask yourself, is this pressure appealing to reason or to fear? Is it asking for clarity or compliance? Is it inviting dialogue or submission? You don't need answers immediately. The pause itself is power. In that pause, you reclaim authorship of your decisions. One practical exercise is to mentally remove the audience. Strip away imagined observers, family opinions, cultural expectations, moral posturing. What remains? Just you and the choice. Epictetus urged his students to ask, is this within my control? Other people's reactions are not. Their approval is not. Their disappointment is not. Your integrity is. Your judgment is. Your character is. When you act from that center, shame loses oxygen. Another exercise is voluntary discomfort. This is classic Stoic training. Do small things that invite mild judgment without harm. Not to provoke, not to rebel, but to desensitize yourself. The goal is not defiance, it's freedom. When you realize that disapproval doesn't destroy you, its threat evaporates. You stop negotiating your values for peace. You start choosing alignment over appeasement. You also need to examine language. Shame hides in words like always, never, should, and normal. When you hear these, slow down. They are not arguments, they are social levers. Replace them internally with questions. Who decides, according to whom, for whose benefit? Advised, ask yourself at every moment, is this necessary? Most pressure collapses under that question. The deeper work is this: stop outsourcing your worth. Shame only works when your self-respect is rented, not owned. The Stoics didn't seek validation from crowds. They sought coherence within themselves. That's why they could stand alone without becoming bitter or hostile. Strength to them was quiet consistency, not loud rebellion, not moral grandstanding, just calm refusal to be ruled by noise. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to expose anything. You don't need to win arguments. Your task is simpler and harder. Govern yourself. When pressure arises, breathe. When guilt appears, inspect it. When shame knocks, ask who invited it. Then act deliberately, not. Over time, people sense this shift. The pressure changes form or disappears altogether, not because you fought it, but because it no longer finds purchase. This is how mental freedom is built, not through dominance, not through withdrawal, through clarity, through restraint, through an unshakable inner court where you are both judge and jury. As Seneca said, a man who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary. Stop suffering in advance. Step into quiet authority. Take one action today that aligns with your judgment, even if it feels slightly uncomfortable. Sit with the feeling. Let it pass. Nothing breaks. You remain intact. Each time you do this, you weaken the hold of social pressure and strengthen something far more important: self-command. Number 9, rewriting history to justify behavior. At some point, you begin to notice something unsettling. The past no longer stays where it belongs. It starts shifting. Conversations you remember clearly feel rewritten. Motives are reassigned. Intentions are reinterpreted. What once felt mutual is reframed as one-sided. And slowly, subtly, the story changes, not to discover truth, but to justify behavior. This is one of the most psychologically corrosive dynamics inside marriage, and it doesn't begin with malice. It begins with discomfort. When someone feels inner conflict between who they believe they are and how they're acting, the mind looks for relief. And the easiest relief is not accountability. It's revision. You feel this most when logic no longer matters. Facts are acknowledged and dismissed in the same breath. Emotional certainty replaces objective memory. The Stoics warned against this long before modern psychology put a name to it. Epictetus said, "People are not disturbed by things but by the views they take of them." When behavior clashes with values, the view must change, or the person must. Most choose the view. The past becomes a tool. Memory becomes plastic. And you are left questioning not just the relationship, but your own perception. This is where the trap tightens. If you try to argue facts, you lose. If you defend your memory, you're accused of being rigid. If you stay silent, the new narrative hardens. Over time, this rewiring of history trains you to doubt yourself. You begin rehearsing conversations in your head, searching for what you must have missed. You become cautious, then hesitant, then emotionally economical. That's not partnership. That's psychological erosion. Warned himself daily, waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. The danger isn't disagreement. The danger is when truth becomes optional and emotional justification becomes sovereign. What makes this especially damaging is that it masquerades as growth. You're told people change, perspectives evolve, feelings are fluid. All of that can be true and still be used as a shield against responsibility. When history is rewritten, accountability evaporates. Actions are no longer measured by standards, only by current emotion. And if emotion is king, consistency becomes impossible. You cannot build stability on something that refuses to stay still. This is where Stoic discipline becomes your anchor, not to win arguments, not to dominate narratives, but to remain internally sovereign. The Stoics never asked you to control others, they asked you to govern yourself. Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free." Brave here doesn't mean loud, it means grounded. It means refusing to outsource your sense of reality to someone else's emotional weather. You do not need permission to remember accurately. You do not need consensus to remain sane. But here's the part most people avoid. If history is being rewritten around you, your task is not to chase the past, it's to anchor in the present. You stop trying to correct narratives and start observing patterns. You stop pleading for acknowledgement and start measuring alignment. Stoicism teaches that clarity comes from repeated observation, not emotional reaction. Patterns don't lie. Rewrites do. This doesn't mean hardening your heart. It means sharpening your perception. When behavior is constantly justified by reinterpreting yesterday, today becomes unstable. And if today is unstable, tomorrow is unsafe. The Stoics believed peace comes from living in accordance with reality, not preferred stories. Put it simply, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Your power returns the moment you stop estimating yourself through someone else's revision. Now you don't fix this by confrontation alone. You fix it by rebuilding your internal structure. Start with this exercise. Write down your principles, not what you expect from others, but what you expect from yourself. Clarity is armor. When your values are explicit, distortion loses its grip. Then practice temporal grounding. Each day, briefly note what happened, how you responded, and what you felt. Not to obsess, to remember. Memory strengthens when respected. Over time, this quiet practice restores confidence in your own perception. Another exercise, train emotional delay. When a narrative shift occurs, don't respond immediately. The Stoics believe time reveals truth better than impulse. Sit with the discomfort. Let the fog clear. Ask yourself one calm question. Does this explanation align with repeated behavior or only with emotional convenience? You don't need to accuse. You don't need to convince. You only need to see clearly. And finally, practice what Epictetus called the dichotomy of control. You cannot control whether someone rewrites the past. You can control whether you internalize it. You can choose to remain composed, consistent, and grounded. That alone changes the dynamic. People behave differently around someone who cannot be emotionally destabilized. This is not about cynicism, it's about self-respect. Marriage only becomes a trap when one person is required to abandon their memory, their standards, and their inner compass to keep the peace. That peace is counterfeit. Real peace comes from coherence, when your thoughts, values, and actions align. Stoicism doesn't ask you to endure distortion. It teaches you to rise above it. You are not here to argue your reality into existence. You are here to live it. When you stop chasing rewritten histories and start embodying quiet certainty, something shifts. Either the dynamic corrects, or clarity gives you the strength to choose differently. In both cases, you win. Because the mind that cannot be rewritten without consent is a mind that cannot be controlled. Number 10, security replacing desire once the deal is sealed. There's a moment most people never question, and yet it quietly reshapes everything. The moment when commitment is secured, when the future feels guaranteed, when the uncertainty that once created tension dissolves into safety. That shift feels comforting on the surface, but beneath it, something subtle often changes. Desire, which thrives on presence, polarity, and effort, begins to loosen its grip. Security moves in. And if you're not conscious, security doesn't sit beside desire, it slowly replaces it. The Stoics warned you about this long before modern relationships existed in their current form. Epictetus said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Desire fades when self-mastery fades, when effort becomes optional, when growth pauses because the deal feels done. You don't lose attraction because you became inadequate. You lose it because the conditions that once demanded your best version quietly disappeared. Desire is not sustained by promises. It is sustained by presence. It lives in who you are becoming, not in what has already been agreed upon. When certainty becomes absolute, when roles harden, when identity stagnates, desire often withers, not out of malice but out of neglect. Security soothes, desire challenges, and human nature, when left unchecked, chooses comfort over intensity almost every time. This is where most people get trapped mentally. You are taught that commitment should automatically produce desire, that loyalty guarantees passion, that once the contract is signed, spoken or unspoken, the emotional and physical spark should sustain itself. The Stoics would call this a fantasy rooted in false expectations. Reminded himself, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Desire is an internal phenomenon. It cannot be outsourced to structure, legality, or obligation. When security replaces desire, it usually doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly. Effort becomes inconsistent. Self-respect is replaced with entitlement. Discipline gives way to routine. You stop choosing excellence and start relying on permanence. The danger isn't marriage itself. The danger is psychological arrival, the belief that you've reached the destination, so movement is no longer required. Stoicism teaches you to remain a student of life, even when circumstances feel stable, especially then, because stability is where complacency grows fastest. Desire requires tension, not conflict but polarity, not chaos but contrast. It requires that you remain grounded in purpose beyond approval. When your center shifts from self-command to external validation, attraction erodes. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Desire responds to strength, not guarantees. It responds to clarity, not contracts. It is drawn to a man who is internally governed, not one who is simply secure. Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." Desire dies in wasted time, in unchallenged habits, in days lived on autopilot. If you want to reverse this pattern, you start by reclaiming authorship over yourself, not aggressively, calmly, quietly. You stop asking whether you are liked and start asking whether you are aligned. You stop negotiating your standards for peace. You stop confusing comfort with fulfillment. Security should support your mission, not replace it. Here's a practical exercise. No performance. No explanation to anyone, just honesty. Sit alone and write down the version of yourself you were before certainty set in, not behaviors but qualities, your edge, your curiosity, your discipline. Then write down who you are now. Where have you softened? Where have you postponed growth? Where have you substituted routine for intention? Don't judge it, observe it. Stoicism begins with observation, not self-punishment. Another exercise. For the next 7 days, act as if nothing is guaranteed. Not in fear, in responsibility. Show up fully, speak precisely, train your body, refine your mind. Do not announce the change. Let it be internal. Epictetus warned against performative virtue. This is about embodiment, not display. You must also retrain your relationship with desire itself. Desire is not something you demand from others. It is something you evoke through who you are. When you focus on self-command, your habits, your boundaries, your direction, you stop chasing validation. And paradoxically, that's when attraction often returns. Not because you tried to reclaim it, but because you became anchored again. Stoicism does not ask you to reject connection. It asks you not to cling to outcomes. Attachment to certainty weakens you. Commitment without self-mastery dulls you. The goal is not to destabilize your life, but to remain internally sovereign within it. To keep growing even when no one is watching, especially then. Here's another practice. Each morning, ask yourself one question. What would a disciplined man do today if nothing were owed to him? Then act accordingly. Desire respects men who owe nothing to comfort, who are not governed by ease, who continue sharpening themselves even when applause is absent. Security is not the enemy. Stagnation is. Stability should give you a platform to rise from, not a couch to sink into. When you treat certainty as a foundation rather than a finish line, desire has room to breathe again. Said, waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Desire follows being, not bargaining. You don't fix this dynamic by demanding more affection, more passion, more attention. You fix it by becoming less dependent on outcomes and more committed to excellence. Calm excellence, quiet authority, relentless self-respect. That energy is unmistakable. It doesn't beg. It doesn't explain. It simply exists. Security replacing desire is not a curse. It's a signal, a reminder to return to yourself, to discipline your mind, to live deliberately again. And when you do, whether desire returns or not, you win. Because the Stoic path was never about control over others. It was always about mastery of self. Start today, not with confrontation, with alignment, not with demands, with discipline. That's how you step out of the trap, by realizing you were never meant to live comfortably chained to certainty, but calmly rooted in purpose. Before you rush to conclusions, understand this. This video was never about hating marriage or fearing women. It was about clarity. The Stoics warned that the greatest danger isn't pain or loss, but self-deception. And too many men walk into lifelong commitments half awake, driven by pressure, hope, or fantasy instead of awareness. If this video unsettled you, that's a good sign. Discomfort is often the mind shedding illusions. Marriage is not automatically a trap, but entering it without leverage, boundaries, self-respect, and options always is. Power doesn't come from domination. It comes from independence, from knowing you can walk away and therefore choosing to stay. Remember this: people respect what does not need them. The moment your identity, peace, and purpose are no longer negotiable, every relationship in your life changes, romantic or otherwise. So don't react emotionally, reflect strategically, rewatch this video if needed. Let the ideas sit, let them sharpen you. If you found value here, like the video, subscribe, and share it with a man who needs to hear this before it's too late. Because the cost of ignorance is always higher than the cost of truth.